Zohran Mamdani used to think the machine was too big to touch until he touched it. He wasn't supposed to, not there, not like that. But what started with the clatter of a lunch tray in the Albany legislative cafeteria turned into a reckoning. He's got money in it. That's why they got the contracts. The voice was barely above a whisper, almost lost in the hum of trays and idle political gossip. Zohran didn't look up right away. He took another sip of his masala chai and kept his eyes on the stack of housing bills in front of his own. But that sentence stuck. It wasn't like the usual rumors, bitterness from losing aides, lazy barbs thrown in the hallway. This voice wasn't bitter. It was afraid. Later that afternoon, walking back toward his cramped office in the Capitol's legislative office building, Zohran couldn't shake it. Mayor Eric Adams' name had been showing up in too many closed-door discussions lately. Quiet pushes for NYPD funding hikes, sweetheart contracts for surveillance tech, resiliency projects with zero public bidding, most of it flying through committees with too many yes votes and too few questions. He mentioned it casually to his chief of staff, Anissa Malik, whose instincts were sharper than any political consultant in Manhattan. "I heard the same thing last week," Anissa said, glancing up from her screen. "Something about the mayor leaning on the emergency management office. But no one's naming names. Everyone's terrified." Zohran frowned. "Terrified of what? Losing their job?" "Or worse," she said. "People here protect their careers like it's a firstborn child." But Zohran wasn't easily intimidated. He'd been discounted too many times, first for being a socialist, then for being a Muslim, then for being right. He had a memory like a steel trap and a mouth that didn't ask permission. By Thursday, 3 separate staffers from different committees had made vague references to Adams' pipeline, a nickname for a pattern of recurring contracts quietly funneled through 2 Brooklyn-based subcontractors with spotty public records and offshore financial links. Every time Zohran asked for details, the response was the same. Ask the wrong question and you'll get iced out. But Zohran had built his career on asking the right question in the wrong room and making people squirm. That Friday, he entered a closed-door session on municipal procurement oversight in room 217 at the Albany Capitol. He kept his tone even, his questions sharp. Why was this contract exempt from the competitive bidding process? Who sits on the vendor selection panel? Why did the same 2 firms keep winning year after year? The moment Eric Adams' name came up, 3 people wouldn't meet his gaze. One staffer in a blue-check tie stood up and left the room entirely. Back in his office, Zohran stared at his whiteboard. Names, arrows, calendar dates. No hard proof yet, just a gut feeling. But his gut had never failed him before. As he packed up to leave, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. Then came the text. "You're asking about the wrong people, but you're right. Be careful." He stared at the screen for a full minute. For once, he had no comeback. He handed the phone to Anissa, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. By morning, a second message arrived. "Meet me at the bottom escalator in Grand Central. Navy windbreaker, come alone." He didn't respond right away. Didn't want to seem eager. But something in him stirred. If this was real, if someone inside was ready to talk, then this wasn't just smoke anymore. It was fire. He walked over to the window. Outside, New Yorkers moved like nothing was wrong. Tourists, interns, journalists chasing the day's headlines. But Zohran could feel it in his bones. Something was rotting beneath the city, and someone was finally scared enough to speak. Zohran grabbed his coat and scribbled a quick note on a yellow sticky pad for Anissa. "Grand Central, watch your phone. If I don't text in 45, call it in." He left without another word. What he didn't know was that someone else was already watching him. Grand Central Terminal was buzzing as always. Families lugged suitcases, college kids stared into their phones. A few lobbyists in expensive coats tried to blend in. Zohran walked through with quiet purpose, scanning without staring. He wasn't here for drama. He was here for answers. The bottom escalator near the back of the food court was quieter. He positioned himself near the Magnolia counter, pretending to check train times on his phone. Then he saw him, mid-30s, clean-shaven, Navy windbreaker, just like the message said. Hands in pockets, eyes nervous, scanning. The man hesitated, just for a second, then turned and moved toward the stairwell by the bookstore. Zohran followed. They didn't speak until they were out of the main flow of commuters. At the base of the stairwell, the man stopped, looked over his shoulder, then faced Zohran. No introductions. "You don't know me, he said, voice low and shaky, "and I'm not doing this again. I just need this off me." He handed Zohran a manila envelope, thick, sealed, and taped shut. Zohran didn't reach for it right away. "You worked for Adams?" The man gave a single nod. 5 years, legislative operations, then scheduling. "Why now?" The man rubbed the back of his neck as if it hurt to answer. "Because he's not who he says he is, and because someone has to do something before it gets worse. I thought about going to a reporter," he continued, "but that's suicide. They'll find me, tear me apart in a week. But you," he paused, "you ask the kind of questions that get things moving." Zohran finally took the envelope. "What's in here?" "Money trails, email records, pressure points, internal memos from contractors." He took a breath. "It's enough to show how deep he's tied in." He hesitated. "And names. You'll see names you won't believe." Zohran stared at him. "I just ask one thing. Protect my identity." "Your name won't leave my lips unless you say so," Zohran replied without hesitation. The man gave a weak smile, checked his watch. "Be careful," he said, already turning. "They don't come at you directly. They just ruin your life, one piece at a time." And then he disappeared into the crowd. Back in his apartment in Astoria, Zohran locked the door behind him, drew the curtains, sat down at his dining table and placed the envelope in front of him. It felt heavy, not just the paper, the meaning, the risk. He opened it slowly. Inside, printed emails, screenshots, a USB drive, photocopies of bank transfers, money flowing from a PAC tied to Adams' donor network into a shell company registered out of Delaware. He'd seen this kind of structure before, layers meant to hide just enough but not everything. But it wasn't just money. There were internal memos from private contractors, mentions of Eric's guy at the emergency management office, instructions to prioritize contracts that didn't meet minimum security protocols. And then, the most damning part, a transcript of a phone call. No names, just labels. SCN and agent. SCN, you know what needs to happen. They're the best choice in Equanum. Make it happen, agent. They're not even on the short list. SCN, don't make this difficult. You want my support on city resilience allocation? Then do your job. Zohran read the page, once, twice, a third time, vague on its own, but with everything else. It was a map of manipulation. He picked up his phone. "Get to my place," he told Anissa. "Now, and bring the portable scanner." 10 minutes later, she showed up, hoodie half-zipped, takeout container in one hand. "Jesus, Z, what is it?" He slid the envelope toward her. "Read." Anissa read slowly, quietly. Her food went cold. "You know what this is?" she asked finally. Zohran nodded. "A powder keg." "Can you verify any of it?" "I will." They stayed up most of the night, cross-referencing city contracts, state records, campaign finance filings, LinkedIn job histories, and archived committee reports. Some of the connections were buried deep, but they were there. Companies no one had heard of tied to initiatives the mayor had fast-tracked, with middlemen from agencies that weren't supposed to be involved. By 4 a.m., Anissa leaned back in her chair and exhaled hard. "This isn't just bad optics," she said. "This is criminal." Zohran didn't respond. He was staring at a sheet of paper, a list of names. Some were high-level aides. Others were part of the Office of Emergency Management or the Department of Buildings. And one worked in the New York State Comptroller's office. But the worst part wasn't what he had read. It was what he hadn't read yet. On that USB drive. Zohran didn't sleep, neither did Anissa. They worked in shifts, their eyes dry, fingers aching from scrolling, clicking, typing. The drive held folders, neatly labeled, containing months of encrypted message logs, calendar invites, digital bank statements, and details of off-the-books consulting bonuses. And it wasn't just Adams anymore. At least 4 other city officials were indirectly tied to companies Adams had pushed forward in budget hearings. Some names didn't surprise Zohran. Others sent chills down his spine. People he passed in the Capitol corridors. People who smiled in committee. People who signed his birthday card last month. And then there was CM. That name, or rather, those initials, kept showing up in internal chats between execs at MetroCore Solutions, a mid-size infrastructure contractor based in Brooklyn. Always vague, always cautious. CM says push the permits before oversight starts asking questions. CM wants a face-to-face with EA before the city council briefing. At 6:00 a.m., Anissa finally leaned back again and let out a low whistle. "This is national-level dirty," she said, "and you're about to walk straight into it." Zohran nodded slowly, scrolling through a particularly damning email chain. They built this like a fake LLCs, nonprofit fronts, donations routed through charter school grants. He paused at one message from a PAC director to a known Adams staffer. Subject line, winner push. Inside, one line, make sure the friendly faces at DOB clear the board before January. MetroCore can't lose that contract. Not after all the grease. Anissa looked over his shoulder. "That's your smoking gun. And we're not even halfway through this mess." Before Zohran could reply, his phone rang, unlisted number. He answered, ready this time. "You got it?" said the same voice from Grand Central. "But they're watching now. You're on a list. You need to be smart." "What do you want from me?" Zohran asked, not hiding his frustration. "Just truth," the voice said. "I gave you more than I ever planned to. But once it's out, you're on your own." "You think I'm scared of that?" A pause. "You should be." Click. The line went dead. Zohran's first instinct was to go public, drop it to a trusted journalist, force the conversation. But no, this needed more than headlines. If he moved too fast, they'd spin it, drown it in talking points and manufactured outrage. If this was going to land, it needed airtight proof, precise timing, and bipartisan backing. So he called in a favor. That afternoon, he met with Assemblyman Peter Halbrook from Long Island, a Republican with a clean ethics record and zero tolerance for backroom deals. They'd clashed before on housing policy, but respected each other's honesty. They met off the radar in a quiet lounge room inside the New York State Library. No cameras, no aides, no distractions. Zohran laid it out in stages. First the documents, then the emails, then the audio transcript. Halbrook barely blinked. "This is real?" he asked finally. "As real as it gets," Zohran said. "And I need bipartisan support," Zohran said plainly. "If I bring this forward alone, I'll get steamrolled." Assemblyman Peter Halbrook scratched his chin, then looked Zohran in the eye. "You know you're risking your entire career." Zohran didn't flinch. "And what's it worth if I sit on this?" Halbrook gave a small nod. "You'll have my voice, and I'll bring two others, people who won't fold when the pressure comes." Back in the office, Zohran and Anissa scanned every file, every page. Anissa prepped encrypted backups and stashed them on multiple drives. They were being watched now. That much was clear. A black SUV circled the block twice. A strange call came to the front desk, asking if a Mr. Raj's Poetry Club was traveling to Buffalo this weekend. No one on staff had ever heard that phrase before. They didn't panic. They adjusted. Every copy of the evidence was printed and hidden in different places. One went into a fireproof box in Anissa's cousin's garage in Yonkers. Another was sent with a law school friend of Zohran's in Chicago. A third was sealed, certified, and mailed to an investigative law firm in Oakland with one instruction: open only if Zohran Mamdani fails to make contact within 14 days. Zohran wasn't naive. He knew how fast people in power could disappear, reputationally or otherwise. But through all the noise, one thing stayed clear. This wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about making a name. It was about cutting out the rot. And the real challenge wasn't collecting the truth. It was knowing when to say it out loud. The next Monday broke gray and humid, but inside the state capitol, the air felt sharper, like something was about to shift. Zohran entered through the side entrance just before sunrise, a leather folio tucked under his arm, packed with fresh printouts. Anissa tailed him closely, earbuds in, whispering from the checklist, verified timestamps. Cross-match the wire transfers. Prep encrypted USB for secure drop. At 7:05 a.m., inside a small, windowless committee room, Holbrook arrived, flanked by two trusted colleagues, Assemblywoman Beth Morales from Queens and Assemblyman Colin Rayner from Buffalo. Both were veterans, both hated corruption, and neither had any love for political theater. Zohran didn't waste time. Eric Adams steered over $200 million in contracts to MetroCore Solutions, he said, tapping a chart Anissa had color-coded overnight. In return, he received financial gains through ghost dividends routed via a shell company. Third Shore Consultants, registered in Delaware. The company doesn't physically exist, but Adams's brother-in-law sits on its board. Morales set her coffee down so hard the lid popped. That's not a policy dispute, that's a crime scene. Rayner leaned forward, jaw tense. Evidence is strong, but process matters. Ethics will stall, leadership will stall. We need two things, public heat and procedural leverage. Holbrook agreed. We file an ethics complaint today, then push for a joint oversight hearing. In the meantime, we leak just enough to force the media to chase the trail. But Zohran shook his head. If we let this drip, Adams' team will build counter-narratives. We need one controlled detonation. Documents, timeline, testimony, all at once, no spin, no time to react. The room went quiet. Then Anissa spoke. Then we pick a date and lock the doors behind us. Holbrook nodded slowly. I'll line up the signatures across the aisle, but be warned, you're going to feel the heat. Midnight phone calls, threatened donors, chairs killing your bills. They'll hit you where it hurts. Zohran's voice was steady. I didn't run for office to count favors. Outside, the first wave of pushback rolled in fast. A columnist at the Daily Ledger ran an op-ed accusing Mamdani of weaponizing activist gossip for personal gain. Within hours, bot accounts flooded Twitter and TikTok, parroting the narrative. A local AM radio host in Staten Island claimed Zohran had a vendetta against Adams after his housing bill got buried in committee. A popular radio host in Brooklyn claimed Zohran had a vendetta against Mayor Eric Adams because Adams once blocked an environmental housing amendment Zohran had championed. But Anissa and the team weren't guessing. They documented every smear. Several were traced back to a media firm called Silver Scope Strategies, which had received direct payments from a PAC aligned with Adams just 2 weeks earlier. The dots were connecting themselves. That afternoon, Adams's chief of staff, Patrick Morales, cornered Anissa near the elevator in the Capitol Annex. Your boss is walking into traffic, he murmured, barely moving his lips. Tell him he still has time to change lanes. Anissa stepped aside and met his eyes. We're not the ones playing chicken. That night, Zohran's apartment lights flickered 3 times, then went dark. 15 minutes later, a technician from Coned showed up, claiming a routine grid inspection. Anissa called the utility supervisor directly. No such work order existed. They didn't panic. They switched to battery lanterns, copied the files again, and kept working. By Wednesday, the New York Inspector General's office confirmed a receipt of Zohran's preliminary report. 1 hour later, a senior advisor from the State Oversight Committee called Zohran directly. Some of your figures don't add up, the voice said, polished and measured. You might want to hold off until we verify a few things. Zohran recognized the tone, polite stalling, buying Eric Adams more time. Verification is the reason I'm calling the hearing, Zohran answered, and hung up. Every door he opened revealed 2 more, but he refused to let go of the thread. Anissa scheduled meetings with forensic accountants at the New York Fiscal Review Office. Assemblywoman Morales arranged a quiet sit-down with Oversight Chair Trent Ellsworth, who agreed to fast-track witness protection for the whistleblower. But the pressure kept shifting shape. A former donor suddenly pulled funding from a youth STEM program in Zohran's district. A local political podcast began floating rumors of a campaign finance investigation against him. No substance, just enough smoke to seed doubt back home. Zohran didn't flinch. He recorded a 90-second video in his office. When people in power are scared of the truth, they don't argue it. They try to bury it. I won't stop doing this work, no matter how loud the noise gets. He posted it, then went back to work. Thursday evening, Holbrook called from his office overlooking Broadway. I have the votes to demand an emergency hearing, he said. But Adams' team filed a motion to delay on procedural grounds. They're playing for time. We don't have time, Zohran said, rubbing his temples. File a counter motion. Cite imminent cyber and procurement risks. Use the contractor emails, the ones about skipping security checks. Good angle, Halbrook said. You ready for cameras? Zohran exhaled. Born ready. Just before midnight, Anissa handed him a final packet. Testimony outline, source index, chain of custody log. Zohran flipped through it, then closed it. Because the moment he stepped into the hearing the next morning, he'd find out. The real fight hadn't even begun. The hearing room felt colder than usual. Not the temperature, the tone. It was just past 8 a.m. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. Cameras were barred, no press, just representatives, legal observers, and the occasional political shark, hiding behind a yawn and a clipboard. Zohran Mamdani sat at the long table in the center, back straight, folder sealed with a red clip. Anissa stood behind him along the wall, arms crossed, scanning the room like something might explode. At the head of the panel sat Chairwoman Alita Frey, a polished centrist from Westchester, known for caution and procedural precision. Tonight, her lips were pressed tighter than usual. Assemblyman Mamdani, she said, you may proceed. Zohran nodded. No speech, no drama. He unclipped the folder and began handing out the documents. One packet per panel member. These documents include financial records, internal communications, procurement anomalies, and excerpts from a whistleblower statement implicating Mayor Eric Adams in direct interference with municipal contract approvals. His voice was calm, measured, but sharp. The room didn't breathe. Zohran tapped the second page of the packet. This page outlines financial transfers between Third Shore Consultants and a chain of subsidiary accounts tied to MetroCore Solutions, spanning the last 17 months. He looked up briefly, letting the words settle. These transfers line up almost exactly with municipal budget markups in the scheduling of closed-door procurement briefings. A few panel members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Assemblyman Nolan Grant from Staten Island lifted the packet closer to his face. Brow furrowed. Zohran continued, flipping to the next page. Page 4 details internal communications. Encrypted metadata confirms that the source IP for dozens of contacts with officials at the Department of Citywide Administrative Services came directly from devices in the mayor's office. Some of those communications occurred well outside official business hours. Chairwoman Frey raised a hand. Do you have verification on these logs? Zohran didn't blink. Yes, verified by an independent digital forensics firm. Their affidavit and methodology are included in the appendix. Grant set his packet down. Are we expected to believe that a sitting mayor manipulated city contracts for personal gain? Zohran looked him straight in the eye. You're not expected to believe anything until you read the documents, but you are expected to act once you do. No one spoke for a long while. Then Zohran reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small black Bluetooth speaker. This audio clip is a phone call between a senior executive at MetroCore and a city agency liaison. It was submitted under whistleblower protection. Identifying names are redacted until we secure additional legal shielding. He pressed play. A voice crackled through the speaker, low, impatient, unmistakably real. If Adams says they're getting the contract, they're getting the contract. I don't care what the internal audit says. Make it happen, or we'll find someone else who will. Several panel members exchanged glances. Some recoiled slightly. The room held its breath. Then Chairwoman Frey leaned forward, fingers steepled. Assemblyman Mamdani, what are you asking this committee to do? Zohran stood his ground. I'm requesting a formal ethics investigation into Mayor Eric Adams. He spoke slowly, clearly. I'm also requesting that this evidence be referred to the State Attorney General's office for independent review, and that immediate safeguards be placed on all current and pending infrastructure contracts involving MetroCore Solutions. Frey studied him. And what if this committee declines? Zohran didn't hesitate. Then I'll walk out of this room and take it to the people. Another silence. Then from the back of the room, I second the motion for an ethics probe. It was Assemblywoman Beth Morales. One by one, others followed. Holbrook, Rayner, 2 Democrats, even Grant. After a long pause, the motion passed. Chairwoman Frey sat back and exhaled slowly. Then it begins. Zohran gathered his binder, gave a small nod, then turned. Outside the chamber, Anissa was already texting updates. A reporter from the Albany Sentinel had caught wind of the late-night session and was circling like a hawk. Zohran ignored the calls for now. As he and Anissa stepped into the hallway, Halbrook caught up to them. "You just lit a fuse," he said, matching Zohran's stride. "I didn't come here to watch things rot," Zohran replied. Halbrook gave a short smile. "Then you better be ready, because by tomorrow morning, New York politics won't look the same." But what none of them knew was just how fast that fuse would burn. By sunrise, it was already out. Someone had leaked a fragment of the packet to a reporter at the Hudson Tribune. Not the full file, not the audio, just one page. But that page had Eric Adams' initials, a suspicious wire transfer, and a timestamp tied to a closed-door meeting in Lower Manhattan. And that was enough. News stations scrambled. Cable hosts cleared their morning rundowns. Lower thirds across major outlets lit up with phrases like contract rigging scandal, Adams ethics probe, calls for resignation mount. By 9:00 a.m., the top trend in the country was #Adams resigned. Zohran watched from his office, arms crossed. Anissa paced behind him. "You leak it?" he asked without turning around. "Nope," Anissa said, shaking her head. But whoever did wanted to light the fuse early. Could have been someone on the panel, maybe even Halbrook. Force the issue before Adams' team could rewrite the narrative. It didn't matter anymore. The country was paying attention now. Outside the Capitol, protesters began to gather. Some held signs praising Zohran. Others just wanted answers. MetroCore Solutions was trending, so were corporate lobbying and city council complicity. By noon, Adams' office issued a flat statement. "Mayor Adams has always acted in the best interest of New Yorkers. Any implications to the contrary are politically motivated distractions. We will cooperate fully." It was too little, too late. Zohran took a deep breath and agreed to appear live that evening on NY1's Inside City Politics. He didn't grandstand, he didn't smile. He wore a navy blazer and kept his voice even. "I'm not here to punish anyone," he said. "I'm here to protect the public trust. If people in power are abusing their positions to get rich while risking our city's infrastructure, our safety, and our dignity, then we owe it to the people who elected us to stop it." The anchor leaned in. "Are you afraid this could backfire? That the political system will close ranks to protect one of its own?" Zohran didn't hesitate. "Let them. We'll see how long they last under the weight of the truth." The clip went viral overnight. Anissa spent hours sorting through interview requests. Meanwhile, Adams vanished. No press conferences, no public comments. His team offered vague explanations: medical leave, security reassessment, reviewing options. But insiders knew his allies were scrambling. Zohran's office line rang nonstop, half hate, half hope. Anonymous threats, voicemails of gratitude from voters he'd never met in places he'd never been. Late that night, Anissa's burner phone lit up. A man named Dwight Alton, a former procurement officer for the mayor's Office of Operations, said he had information. Irregular briefings, meetings held off the record as far back as 2021. But he'd only talked to Zohran. They arranged to meet the next day in Beacon, New York, neutral ground outside the spotlight. Before Zohran could leave the office, Anissa stepped in with a strange look on her face. "You're going to want to see this," she said, holding up a printout. The headline read, "Mayor Eric Adams under formal investigation, facing possible suspension." Zohran scanned it twice. "The panel didn't wait," Anissa explained. "They voted to send it straight to the State Ethics Committee and to the AG's office." She looked at him. "You shook the system, and now it's rolling." But Zohran didn't celebrate, not yet. He knew how fast politics could turn. Support was real, but so was fear. People wanted to be on the right side of history, but they also wanted jobs, campaign donations, quiet retirements. And now the whispers had turned, not about Adams, about Zohran. Too ambitious. He wants a mayoral run. He's dangerous. Zohran stood by the window. The dome of the Capitol glowed against the night sky. They'll say I'm trying to build a brand, he said. Anissa shrugged. Let them talk. Truth doesn't need a PR team. But what none of them knew was that another name, someone higher, was about to surface, and Adams would look like a pawn in comparison. The chamber was packed the next morning, but quieter than usual. Live coverage from NY1 showed nervous hands tapping pens, eyes darting across party lines. The name Eric Adams hung over the room like a fog no one wanted to name. Overnight, Chairwoman Frey had drafted a resolution calling for a full suspension of Mayor Adams pending the outcome of the ethics investigation. It hadn't happened in New York City in decades. Zohran sat in the gallery, flanked by 2 plainclothes officers and a few close aides. No gloating, no smiles, just stillness. He'd done his part. Now the system would have to decide if it still had a soul. On the floor, Assemblyman Reed Carver took the mic. This isn't about left or right, it's about betrayal of the process, of the people, of the purpose of public service. If we ignore this, we tell every future official that personal profit is an acceptable cost of leadership. Polite nods, some folded arms. Then Assemblywoman Tyler Graves, a centrist from Syracuse, rose. None of us want to be here, but our constituents are watching. If they see us protect our own at the expense of the truth, then maybe we don't deserve their trust. Then, silence. Chairperson Merritt called for the vote. 6 minutes later, 72 in favor of suspension, 23 against, 5 abstained. The room didn't cheer, it didn't erupt. It simply paused. Mayor Eric Adams was no longer in active office. He wasn't there to hear it. No one knew where he was. Back in the office, Zohran watched the news flash across 3 screens at once. Anissa handed him a cup of black coffee, sat down across from him. You did it, she said softly. Zohran shook his head. We did what we were supposed to. He hadn't eaten all day, but food could wait because the real fight wasn't the vote. It was what came next. The hearings, the subpoenas, the people who helped Adams, the ones still hiding. And then he saw it. Yishem, that name again, this time in the subject line of a leaked internal memo from MetroCore's legal counsel. Prepare briefing for CM, possible liability exposure if Mamdani presses forward with Phase 2. Anissa leaned over his shoulder. You still haven't figured out who that is? Zohran shook his head, but they're scared of him. Whoever CM is, he's higher up the food chain than Adams. Adams took orders. They sat in silence. Then Zohran picked up the phone and called Halbrook. We're not done. I need authorization to keep tracing the money. We missed someone. Halbrook didn't hesitate. Then we keep going. But you know what this means, right? Zohran sighed. They're going to come for me harder now. Halbrook didn't disagree. Outside, protesters had returned, but not for Adams. This time, they held signs with Zohran's name. Some read, Truth Still Matters. Protect our whistleblowers. Corruption kills communities. One older man approached Zohran's car as he left the building. Security tried to stop him, but Zohran rolled the window down. The man looked about 60, wore a mechanic's uniform, eyes tired, but kind. I don't know how politics works, he said, but you did something real. My brother was a city sanitation worker for 20 years. If even one contract cut corners on safety just to make some rich guy richer, thank you for stopping it. Zohran didn't answer right away. He just nodded. Once. Thank you for telling me. I don't know how politics works, the man said softly, but you did something real. My brother served 2 tours overseas. If even one contract was filled with bad armor just to make some guy rich, thank you for stopping it. Zohran didn't answer right away. He just nodded once. Thank you for telling me. He got home late. Anissa was still on the phone with Halbrook, coordinating the next moves. Zohran sat at the same table where weeks earlier he'd first opened the manila envelope. Now it was buried under folders, thumb drives, legal pads, and names. Somewhere in those names was the real power, the one who never signed anything, never emailed directly, just whispered instructions and moved people like pieces. And Zohran was getting closer. 2 days after the vote, the Capitol still felt unsettled. Adams' name had been stripped from office signage, his ID credentials invalidated, staff access revoked. Files were seized by the State Ethics Commission. The news cycle had begun to move on, but Zohran hadn't. In fact, he was only stepping into the storm. The whistleblower, the man in the Navy windbreaker, finally agreed to testify under oath. His real name? Elias Brenner, 39, former deputy scheduler and procurement liaison in Adams' administration. For years, he had watched contracts traded like poker chips, emails wiped before backup servers could catch them, meetings held in basements and diners instead of city conference rooms. Guilt, it turned out, didn't scream. It whispered until it ate you alive. Now, sitting across from Zohran and Halbrook in a secure hearing room, Elias looked hollow, cheeks sunken, eyes that barely blinked. "I never thought I'd make it this far alive," he whispered. "You're safe now," Zohran said, "but we need everything." "Who's CM?" Halbrook asked. Elias paused. "WM isn't a person. It's a building used inside the procurement channels. It started showing up after Adams had a private meeting back in 2019 with an exec from a company called Fairstone Holdings." Zohran frowned. "Fairstone, that's the shell firm out of Arizona, right?" "Exactly. The public-facing name is nothing. But beneath it, it's run by Calvin Marin." The name hit Zohran like a dropped hammer. Calvin Marin, former intelligence contractor turned shadow investor, known for gliding through oversight hearings with nothing but a smirk and a perfect tie. He never held office. He didn't need to. He owned surveillance companies, private security firms, and consulting groups embedded in government systems across 5 states. "You're saying Marin was Adams' handler?" "No," Elias said. "I'm saying Adams was a tool. Marin ran the game." The room went quiet. They had spent months hunting the mayor. They'd forgotten to look past him. 5 minutes later, Anissa burst in, pale, holding a manila folder. "We've got a problem," she said. She tossed it on the table. Inside, screenshots of a smear campaign already in motion. Paid articles across anonymous blogs and political sites. Accusations of retaliation, fabricated donations, even claims Zohran had personal ties to MetroCore's competitors. "They're flipping the story," she said. "And guess who owns 3 of these media outlets?" Zohran already knew the answer. "Calvin Marin." Elias nodded. "That's how he works. He never shows up. He just owns the room you're standing in." By morning, Zohran's inbox was on fire. Journalists demanding answers about fake donations. A fake website had appeared overnight with doctored wire transfers tied to Zohran's old community law practice. A TV pundit accused him of being a plant for the public sector unions. All lies, all fast, but Zohran stood his ground. He recorded a quick video from his office. No makeup, no sound team, no edits. They're trying to bury the truth under noise, but noise doesn't change facts. If you want to know who's scared, look at who's paying to discredit the messenger. It was viewed over 3 million times in 12 hours. That afternoon, Halbrook and Morales returned to his office. "The AG's in," Halbrook said. "They're launching a formal investigation into Marin's companies. They want access to everything." "Give it to them," Zohran said. "All of it. No subcommittees, no sealed folders. Let the public see what unchecked power really looks like." That night, something happened that didn't surprise Zohran, but still stung. Assemblyman Zohran, a longtime ally, went on live radio. "Mamdani's overreaching. This feels like a political power play." Anissa raised an eyebrow. "He's scared of what else is in those files. He sat on the same oversight subcommittee in 2020. If Marin had Adams, he might have had Owen too." Zohran didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew. The next morning, Zohran entered the State Oversight Committee hearing room. There at the far end of the table sat Calvin Marin. Impeccable suit, silver cufflinks, cool, unreadable eyes. No press allowed. Just lawmakers. Just lawyers. He stood as Zohran entered. "Assemblyman Mamdani," he said smoothly. "You've certainly stirred a reaction." Zohran didn't shake his hand. "I'm not here to stir. I'm here to clean." They sat. The questioning began, and Zohran realized something. Marin was rehearsed, polished, controlled. He spoke without a single note. He never admitted, never denied, never broke. But behind that cool gaze, Zohran saw it. Fear, not loud, but present. The kind of fear that comes when a man realizes the wrong person pulled the string this time. The hearing didn't end with fireworks. It ended with a warning. After 3 hours of answers full of misdirection, legal fog, and just enough ambiguity to sidestep perjury, Marin was dismissed. But before he left, Zohran leaned forward for one last question. "Mr. Marin, he said, in your view, should unelected individuals with private interests have influence over public procurement systems?" Marin gave a faint smile, folded his hands calmly. "In my view, Assemblyman, efficiency often requires unconventional partnerships." No one reacted, but the message was clear. Back in his office, Zohran sat with Anissa Morales, and a state AG investigator named Camille Wren, who had flown in from California. She was sharp, early 40s, all business. "You've disrupted something bigger than we imagined," Camille said. "We've got leads tying Marin's holdings to procurement procedures in at least 5 other states. Small towns, county boards, quiet flows of money. This isn't just a New York problem." Zohran nodded. "It's a national infection." "But infections fight back," Camille added. The next morning, 2 websites tied to Zohran's campaign were hit with a coordinated cyber attack. Donations halted, internal emails leaked, closed legal cases from his community defense days twisted into viral clickbait. He defended a man accused of assault in 2012. He represented a whistleblower who later vanished. He's anti-police. None of it stuck. But it wasn't supposed to. The goal was confusion, distortion. They were trying to make people doubt, even for a moment. Anissa paced Zohran's office, phone in hand, scrolling through messages. "They're dragging your name through the mud," she said, trying to make people forget what this was even about. Death by distortion. Meanwhile, whistleblower Elias Brenner was placed into protective custody under orders from the State Attorney General's office. Then a second witness came forward, an anonymous former IT contractor from Marin's cybersecurity firm. He claimed files had been wiped clean days before the ethics hearing. "Too clean," he said in a video affidavit. "They erased the servers like they knew what was coming." That didn't happen without a tip from inside. Zohran froze. Someone inside, not just the Capitol, his own team, the staffers they trusted, someone had fed Marin's camp. It explained the leaks, the fake screenshots, the timing. Zohran called Anissa and Assemblywoman Morales into his conference room and shut the door. "We've got a leak," he said flatly. They combed through every email log, every internal message, every meeting note from the past 3 weeks. 2 aides had access to the files. One had worked with Zohran since the campaign. The other, Matthew Cord, was recommended by a mutual contact in the Transportation Committee. Quiet, smart, always early, too early. He was gone by the next morning, left a note claiming a family emergency, took his badge, erased his hard drive. "He was a plant," Anissa said, throwing a folder on the table. "They knew we'd get close, so they slipped in a failsafe. But they were too late. The files had already been copied. The chain of evidence was intact. The Attorney General's office secured it all." Still, Zohran couldn't shake the feeling. Someone else, someone higher, waiting for the heat to die down. Before resurfacing. Marin had looked calm during questioning, but he wasn't the type to go down quietly. He was the type to bet on time and short memories. So Zohran sped things up. He scheduled a public town hall in Queens. No fancy setup. Folding chairs, a handheld mic, no teleprompter. Just him, face to face with the people who put him in office. A retired Army captain stood up. "I watched what you did," he said. "They're trying to bury you now. What happens next?" Zohran met his eyes. "We keep pulling," he said. "We don't stop just because it gets uncomfortable. The ones who rig the system are betting we'll get tired. But they haven't met the people I represent." That line made local news, then national news. Suddenly, Zohran was back in control of the story, not as a political fighter, as a representative of regular people, working people, the ones who served, sacrificed, and never saw a cent of the corruption now splashed across headlines. But Zohran knew this wasn't the end. Marin still had strings to pull, and Zohran wasn't done cutting them. The school wasn't much. Brick exterior, a few chipped steps, a playground half covered in chalk drawings. But when Zohran Mamdani stepped through the double doors of Elmwood Elementary in Queens, the room erupted like he was the first person in New York politics to ever bother showing up. The town hall was over. The national press had already moved on to a new scandal. But here, inside this third-grade classroom, filled with beanbags, posters, and sticky-fingered kids, was the reason he fought so hard in the first place. He'd been invited by Mrs. Delaney, a teacher who had written him a letter after the hearing. Zohran hadn't planned on accepting. Too much risk, too little time. But something about the handwriting, careful, rounded, written in blue ink, stuck with him. And when things get loud in Albany, sometimes you need to remember why you ever opened your mouth at all. Mrs. Delaney had set up a question and answer circle, 20 kids sitting crisscross on a big checkered rug. Zohran sat with them, knees creaking a little, smiling at their wide eyes. Curious silence. Then one girl, small hair and 2 puffballs, raised her hand. "Are you scared of the people who lied?" Zohran didn't answer right away. "I used to be," he said finally, "but not anymore. Because truth isn't something you carry alone. When you say it out loud, other people start saying it too. And then it gets bigger than the people trying to hide it." The girl smiled. "I'm going to tell the truth, even when it's hard." Zohran nodded. That's where it starts. Outside, the sun was setting over the parking lot. Anissa waited near the car, scrolling headlines. Marin had just been subpoenaed again, this time by the Attorney General's office. A deeper investigation was underway, not just into Marin's businesses, but into campaign finance webs that reached into 8 states and possibly 2 foreign accounts. "What now?" Anissa asked as Zohran slid into the passenger seat. "We don't let up," he said. "We build a firewall. Make sure the next person who tries this knows the risks." "Not worth it?" she smirked. "You ever gonna take a break?" Zohran looked out the window. When the job's done, back in Albany, the conversation had changed. Ethics reform was no longer a footnote. It was front page. A bipartisan group led by Halbrook and Morales drafted the Public Trust and Procurement Act, aimed at closing the loopholes Marin had slipped through. Zohran co-authored 3 sections, including a clause that required financial disclosure for indirect family holdings. He wasn't just cleaning up a mess, he was rewriting the rules. Late one night after another long committee review, Zohran returned home, found an envelope slid under his door. No return address, just a single sheet of paper inside. You didn't just change the game, you reminded people why it matters. He didn't recognize the handwriting. Could have been a staffer, could have been a constituent. Didn't matter. The next day, he hung it on the wall behind his desk. Weeks later, Zohran visited Elias Brenner, now living under a new identity, with help from the Attorney General's office. They met at a small lake in Vermont, on a bench by the water. No reporters, no security detail. Just 2 people who had risked everything to pull something dark into the light. "You think it's really over?" Elias asked. Zohran shook his head. "No, but it's quieter, and people are watching now." Elias stared at the water. "I thought I'd regret giving all that up." Zohran smiled. "You didn't. You just got tired of pretending you didn't see it." That night, Zohran flew back to Queens, walking through the airport without a single flashbulb. No interviews, no distractions, just purpose. Because the real work wasn't just about Adams or Marin, or a contract gone wrong. It was about trust, and how easily it breaks, and how much harder it is to rebuild. Zohran didn't want statues or sound bites. He wanted people to look at government and see themselves again. Not shadows of greed wearing polished smiles. Before he went to bed, he wrote a note in his journal. Truth doesn't shout, it waits. And when it's finally heard, it doesn't leave. If you believe the truth still matters, subscribe to our channel. New stories every week. Stories that remind us what integrity looks like and why it still counts.